right, thank you, Dr. Deb. So let me share my screen. Good morning, everybody. Hopefully everyone has had a wonderful morning. We've had a wonderful keynote speaker this morning. So let's see what I can, do to follow up with that. So I am Tennille Presley. I'm an associate professor of physics. I'm also a CADS faculty fellow. And so what I'm going to be talking with you all about, my background is in biophysics. And so we started doing some work integrating physics, music, and biology. And so I'm going to talk about some of the research. So the title of my presentation is Diversifying Biophysical Influences on the Body Through Variations in Musical Genres Data. And I just want to acknowledge at the forefront my team, Dr. Kaya Prost, and then our undergraduate student, Mr. Timothy Pittman. So just to provide a little bit of background and knowledge, in general, when I mention biophysical parameters, they can ultimately correlate with the way in which electrical signals run through our bodies. And so this simply allows us to be able to account for and decipher different sensations such as heat, cold, excitement, and so forth. And so with this electricity through our bodies, you can almost consider this with respect to the electricity in your home, but on a very much smaller scale. And so with this, more than about 99% of the body's resistance to electric current flow is ultimately at the skin. And so I'll talk a little bit more about this in regards to why I'm making a reference to this as far as it correlates to the skin. So there are some knowledge gaps that exist. So one of the main things that we tend to want to address is how music interacts with the body's mechanisms, how musical studies, they generally use less diverse genres. And so ultimately what I mean by that, very often, if you look at various musical studies, they generalize this information. So they very often tend to refer to it along the lines of classical music or jazz music. So one of our goals is really to address that. And then with that, there's also a lack of data sets that address these particular, what I would say, scientific influences. A lot of studies tend to account for the emotional aspect. So how these scientific or biophysical parameters influence and the musical effect on race, genre, and age. And so in general, our project overview, so since CADS has been funded, our idea is to develop a predictive model for identifying whether like individuals will exhibit comparable biophysical outcomes based on similar musical genres. And so one of the things that I mentioned again is that these genres tend to correlate with classical and jazz music. So what we have at least started doing is looking at this from a different perspective where we are accounting for more genres of music. So rock music, gospel, Afro beats, neo soul, also a person's favorite song, and then in the presence of silence. And then ultimately what we have done is we've utilized what's called the galvanic skin response or skin conductivity, which ultimately correlates back to the electrical activity in the body. And so there's a connection between skin conductivity and emotion. With the skin conductivity, it is an indirect way to account for the electrical activity within the body, and also it's perceived to correlate and account for a person's emotions. And so some of our data is actually a little bit contradictory as it relates to that. So over the past year, we have been able to account for different parameters. And so this is some of our previous outcomes. You may have seen some of this in our presentation from last year. So GSR, or the galvanic skin response, is age dependent and gender dependent. And so this is something we found in our data. Previous data has simply shown that basically females tend to have a higher skin conductivity in comparison to males. And a lot of that simply tends to account for, or suggested that it accounts for, the physiology of women in general. So the makeup of a female in comparison to the male. And so something that we have actually seen is that there are particular parameters, specifically with age and gender, that influence this. So we saw that older males, they demonstrated a higher skin conductivity than females, whereas the opposite effect was simply demonstrated and accounted for in the younger population. Our second piece is that we looked at and utilized the valence arousal model, ultimately correlating right here. So let me see if I can use my pointer. So right here over to the right is just a simple representation of the valence arousal model. And so what you see here is basically the emotion. So with the arousal simply can account for basically whether or not there is a presence of an emotion, but then the valence component is going to make it a little bit more specific where it is accounting for what type of emotion we're looking at. And so with our data, and this was just based upon 10 individuals at this point, we simply were able to demonstrate a positive valence observed in younger female participants. However, the arousal varied. And when we mention younger females, what I want to emphasize, we split these individuals up in regards to individuals that were either younger than 35 years old or individuals that were older than 35. And then our other piece is that we were able to see that rock music exhibited the highest arousal amongst all of our participants. And so with this, I just want to note that for each of these musical genres, these individuals were introduced to a playlist. And while they listened to each genre of music, they were listening to these genres of music for about 2 minutes. We also had a washout period in between each genre as well. And during this process, their skin conductivity was being measured. So some of our more recent data, we have now began to expand our data set. And so what I'm really going to show for you are just a couple of correlations. And so when we think about correlations, we're really accounting for, with these particular musical genres, how were individuals actually responding? So looking to see if they were to listen to particular genres of music, how was their skin conductivity ultimately being correlated? And more specifically with that, we actually did an inverse of skin conductivity. So the formula that I showed, the V is equal to IR, that is one of the foundational equations in physics, ultimately called Ohm's law. So the voltage, the current, and the resistance. And so this data is ultimately based upon the resistance. So a simple way to think about this is the greater amount of resistance you simply have, that's going to be the less amount of electrical conductivity that will be able to happen or occur. And so we started out looking at a 52-year-old female. And so what I want to note within this correlation plot, there are the color of gray, white, and red. So I want to really focus our attention on the red components. And so with this 52-year-old female, what we ultimately were able to see is that this individual tended to have a correlation when they simply listen to neo soul in silence, actually. So in the presence or the absence of basically no music. One thing to note, the order in which these genres are listed is the order in which each individual actually sat and listened to the songs from the particular playlist. So we see here with this 52-year-old female, again, that she tended to have a correlation with neo soul similar to this presence of her actually being in the presence of silence. We then compare this to a 54-year-old male. And so with this, again, focusing on the red, we see that there's actually more correlation that's actually present. One thing to note, if we want to compare this to the neo soul for the female and in the presence of silence, we see there's a little bit of correlation that's here. So it's a little bit pink, but it's not as significant as what we see with the 52-year-old female. The other thing to pay attention to is there's a lot more correlation. So this individual tended to have a significant correlation with gospel when listening to rock, as well as in the presence of silence and gospel. We also did a baseline. So the baseline for this individual actually had a significant correlation with respect to their favorite song.
You have about 3 more minutes.
All right, let me talk faster. All right, so our next piece was simply looking at correlation between gender. And so real quick, I just picked females again. One of the reasons for this was really in regards to just accounting for that correlation between females suggesting to have a higher skin conductivity. We hone in on the red, we see there's a lot of variability. So this female in comparison to this particular female, and so there's a little bit of correlation between the two individuals, but we see that the female here tended to have a lot of correlation in comparison to the female that's on the left. So then the last piece that I want to just kind of highlight is thus far, so we've been able to expand our data set pretty well since we last presented last year. And so our youngest participant is actually 10 years old. And so what we can kind of see here is in the presence of pre-music versus gospel, rock, and silence, this individual had a high correlation. And one thing to note is that in general, we know a lot of stuff happens when we age. And so with this, it suggested that younger individuals are expected to have a higher amount of skin conductivity in comparison to older individuals. But guess what? When we get here, what we see is we have an older participant. Our oldest participant thus far was 72. And with this individual, one thing to note is that they have a lot of correlation that's actually present here. The other thing that I just want to kind of mention as a side note is we talk to these individuals when they participate in our study. And so one of the things the person mentioned was that their favorite genre of music is actually gospel. But if we look here, there's a completely negative correlation that's demonstrated here, especially in comparison to the other genres that they listen to. So it's something that we need to definitely look into and consider further. So a brief snippet that I just want to mention, we looked at this from, again, an electrical aspect. We began now to look at other data sets to see how we can begin to correlate some of our own data that we've been collecting, because one of our deficits is that what we're aiming to do, there's a lack of data sets. So we began tapping a little bit into EEGs, which gives an indication of the electrical activity that's happening within the brain. And so one thing to note with skin conductivity, it actually has a fixed voltage. For EEG, it has a variable voltage. And so I just want to kind of bring your attention to these two EEG scans of a 57-year-old woman and a 35-year-old man. And so with this, it suggested that females, again, tend to have a higher EEG in comparison to men. And so I just want to note, this is just a little bit of data from about 10 seconds. And so right here at 7 seconds, both the male and the female, they tend to actually have a matching EEG value there. So just want to note that. And so we just kind of honed into basically the frontal midline for our data. And this simply accounts for the neural working language of executive function and enhanced cognitive processing. So with this, I just want to kind of highlight a few things, just noting, so moving forward, what we aim to do is to continue to enhance and expand our data set, again, because one of the big things with data science is big data, and we have not achieved our big data just yet. We also want to begin to integrate and kind of correlate that V is equal to IR. So we've looked at the resistance, we've looked at the voltage a bit, but we want to begin to correlate aspects of alternating current and direct current with EEG, which is what I showed just a little bit of with heart rate, skin conductivity, and other biophysical parameters. We have been able to submit a publication, and so it's taken them a while with COVID, but we're waiting for that last reviewer's comments. And then Tim actually presented for Scholarship Day this year, and he also presented at a national conference last fall at Abercam's, the annual biomedical research conference for minority students. And then ultimately our goal is to tap back into our model development. And so my acknowledgements are here, funding is here, and I know I'm out of time, so I will stop and answer your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Presley. Thank you so much. So any question, please start talking or put your question in the chat box, please.
Dr. Deb stole like one of my minutes when she was introducing us. I had to talk faster.
I know.
Looking at the time.
That is the fun of being the first, right?
Now, I have a question. Well, two questions.
Sure.
Is there a difference between hard rock and soft rock? Or what type of rock do you have in there?
Right. So Dr. Keith, that's one of the big things that we actually need to tap a little bit more into. So our team has been having conversations around whether or not it is the songs that have been chosen or if it falls into genre. So we've started doing a little bit of work where we have had participants, and we have just a little bit of data, very preliminary right now, where we've had individuals to listen to multiple songs within a particular genre to see if there are some differences across the board. So in all honesty, it's not a question that I can answer right now, but it's something that we're working towards doing.
Okay. And Which was, so how many participants do you need? How many more participants do you need? Maybe we could help you with getting folks over to the CADS lab.
The entire triad area.
Okay.
So if you know people, we just need to set up. In general, it takes about 45 minutes or so. Dr. Prost has been good with getting people, about 30 minutes, but each measurement, it takes some time to do. And so one of the big things, we kind of have to have the individuals in isolation because we don't want to skew the data by having other people to listen into the playlist that we have. We've also started diversifying a little bit of the playlist. So I'll say this real quick in regards to looking at instrumental versus lyrical music to see if it's the lyrics, if it's, the music itself and so forth. So we're tapping into this a lot more to kind of see what's happening.